He walked into the hospital expecting a routine business meeting until he saw three little girls in identical pink dresses crying outside the ICU, and one of them looked up at him with his own eyes. Grace Thompson had never planned to stop the visit to the hospital was strictly business. He was there to finalize a funding proposal for a state-of-the-art expansion wing. Everything about his life ran on precision: his schedule, his speech, his thoughts. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had long ago traded emotion for execution. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored navy suit, his briefcase in one hand, his phone in the other, he stepped out of the elevator on the 4th floor, ready to walk straight into a closed-door meeting with the hospital board. But that was before he saw them. Just outside one of the patient rooms in the hallway, three little girls stood side by side, their tiny hands clinging to each other. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old. All three were blonde, wearing simple pastel pink dresses, their faces stained with tears. One girl hugged a stuffed rabbit so tightly it looked like it might fall apart. Another wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The third stared blankly at the floor, her lips trembling. It was the kind of image you don't prepare for, something so out of place in his carefully ordered world that he almost kept walking. But then one of them looked up. Her eyes were the first thing he noticed, wide, brown, and too familiar. Something about the curve of her cheek, the shape of her mouth, the way her eyebrows lifted slightly in distress. It all hit him like a memory he didn't expect to confront. He stopped in his tracks, not knowing why, just knowing he couldn't take another step forward. There were no nurses around, no adults in sight. The girls were alone. Something twisted in his chest as he walked toward them slowly, like approaching a fragile animal that might bolt at any moment. He cleared his throat gently and crouched to their level. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice soft. "Are you girls all right? Did you get separated from someone?" The tallest of the three shook her head. "Our mommy's in the ICU," they said. "We can't go see her yet." He paused. "Are you waiting for someone? Is someone coming to pick you up?" All three shook their heads in unison. "There's no one else," the girl with the stuffed rabbit said. Just mommy." Grace felt his breath hitch. He had no idea why he stayed kneeling there, why he suddenly felt the need to know more. There was something magnetic in the way they looked at him, something that pulled at parts of him he had ignored for years. He wanted to comfort them, but more than that, he needed to understand why he couldn't look away. Then the smallest of the three took a tiny step forward and tilted her head. "Do you work here?" she asked. "No," he replied, "I'm just here." She studied him for a moment and then softly said, "You look like someone mommy talked about before." Grace felt the ground shift under him. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. That was the moment something in his carefully built life began to break, not violently but quietly, a single crack through the surface of certainty, and he hadn't even reached the meeting room yet. Grace couldn't move. He remained crouched in front of the three girls, feeling like the world around him had slowed to a strange, surreal pace. Their words echoed in his mind, especially the last one, "You look like someone mommy talked about." It wasn't just the resemblance or the way they stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. It was the feeling deep in his chest, the sudden certainty that this wasn't a coincidence. He didn't know what to do with it, didn't know where to place the weight of that realization, so he did what he could. He stayed with them. He gently asked their names, and they introduced themselves in soft, slightly trembling voices: Maddie, Chloe, and Jane. Each name was like a small stone dropped into water, rippling through memories he hadn't touched in years. He asked about their mother, and they told him her name was Emma. That name was no stranger. It hit him like a punch to the stomach. He remembered Emma perfectly, the warmth in her voice, the way she used to laugh at things no one else found funny, how she had once looked at him like he was the only man in the world. They had shared something real, something brief but unforgettable, and then she had vanished. They hadn't spoken in 5 years. He had searched once half-heartedly early on, but work had swallowed him whole, and he had let her memory drift further and further away until now, until these three girls, who looked like they might carry pieces of him in their faces, were standing in a hospital hallway with nowhere to go. Grace stood slowly and glanced around. Still no staff had come to check on the girls. He felt an unfamiliar frustration build inside him. How could no one be helping them? He pulled out his phone and walked to the nurse's station. When he got the attention of the woman behind the counter, he kept his voice steady but firm. "There are 3 children alone in the hallway outside ICU room 402, he said. "They've been waiting there for who knows how long. Can someone check on them?" The nurse blinked, then looked toward the corridor. "Oh yes, that's Emma Rivers' room. The girls have been waiting most of the day. We've been short-staffed, and since they weren't technically patients, he didn't let her finish. They're 5, and they're terrified. Someone needs to be responsible for them." She gave him a slightly defensive nod. "I'll notify the social worker." But Grace had already turned back. He didn't need someone else to step in. He couldn't explain it, but he felt something shift inside him. A sense of urgency mixed with responsibility. It wasn't charity, it wasn't guilt, it was something far deeper. When he returned to the girls, they were sitting on the floor now, holding hands, huddled close. He crouched again, this time more slowly. Your mom, he said gently. She and we knew each other a while ago. Chloe, the middle girl, tilted her head. Are you a friend? I think I used to be, he said quietly. Mommy never talks about friends anymore, Maddie added. Only work and bedtime stories. Grace felt something inside him crack again. They talked a little more about their favorite cartoons, their favorite colors, and what they missed about home. None of them cried anymore, but they still clung to one another as if letting go would shatter the fragile safety they'd built in that hallway. When the social worker finally arrived, a kind woman with tired eyes and a clipboard, Grace stood to meet her. She asked who he was, and for a brief moment he didn't know what to say. I'm someone who used to matter to their mother, he said, and I think I might matter to them too. He stayed while the girls were taken to a small waiting room with toys and juice boxes. He gave his number to the social worker and asked for updates. He wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was clear: he wasn't walking away, not from Emma, not from these girls, not from the life that had just reappeared without warning and demanded to be faced. The hours that followed passed in a haze for Grace, but everything inside him remained sharply alert. He hadn't returned to his meeting. The thought of discussing funding proposals while Emma lay unconscious in intensive care and three little girls waited alone in a side room felt almost grotesque. Instead, he spent that day and the next trying to understand what had happened to the woman he once knew and the life that had unfolded in his absence. He learned from the social worker that Emma had been admitted the previous night following a sudden medical crisis. Details were sparse, but the seriousness was clear. She was unconscious and stable, but in critical condition. No other relatives had been listed, no emergency contacts, just the children, just Emma. It was that detail *, no one else * that haunted him. Grace had spent the past 5 years believing Emma had chosen a life without him, that whatever they'd shared had been fleeting or not enough, but now he was beginning to wonder if her silence had come from something else: fear, protection, or sacrifice. He thought back to how their relationship had ended. It wasn't a fight or betrayal. It was a slow drift caused by the growing gap between her quiet world and his corporate climb. She had said goodbye in a note, one he barely had time to read. At the time, he remembered her writing that she needed something real and steady and that she hoped he would someday find it too. He hadn't, not until now. That afternoon he stood in the hallway again, this time outside Emma's room, with a steady beep of monitors faintly audible through the door. A nurse allowed him in for a few minutes. Emma looked so small in the hospital bed. Her blonde hair was damp around her temples, her skin pale, her breathing slow and mechanical. He walked in slowly as though entering a church. He sat beside her, unsure if she could hear him. I don't know what happened to you, he whispered, but I think I finally understand what happened to us. He hesitated, then reached for her hand, gently wrapping his fingers around hers. There are 3 little girls down the hall who look so much like you. It hurts, but they look like me too. I don't know why you didn't tell me. I don't even know if you wanted to, but I met them. Maddie, Chloe, Jane. They're brave, scared, smart. They waited for you all day without complaining. I've never seen anything like it. His throat tightened. The words came slower. Emma, I think they're mine too. He didn't expect a response, but he saw her fingers twitch slightly beneath his. Maybe it was a reflex, maybe it wasn't. Either way, it was enough to make him stay another hour, just sitting there telling her about everything she'd missed, how cold the hallway had been, how Chloe had tried to explain her dream to him in full detail, how Maddie had stood in front of her sisters like a little soldier, and how Jane had quietly clung to the bunny the entire time without saying a word. When visiting hours ended, he returned to the waiting room where the girls sat with coloring books and juice. He brought them dinner, sat on the floor with them and listened to their stories about their mom, how she always kissed them in the same order, how she sang made-up songs when the lights went out, how she whispered always always when they asked if she would ever leave. They talked about bedtime rituals, their favorite toys, the tiny apartment they lived in. The more he listened, the more he saw the gaps his absence had left, the more he realized how much he had missed. At one point Maddie looked at him with wide eyes and asked, "Did you love our mommy?" He paused, caught off guard by the directness, then he nodded slowly. "Yes, I did, very much." "Do you still?" she asked. He thought about it, thought about what love meant now after everything. "Yes," he said finally, "maybe more than I ever did before." That night, after the girls had fallen asleep on a couch in the family waiting area, Grace sat alone in the corner of the room. He stared at the wall for a long time, then took out his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel everything for the next 2 weeks," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, you have." "I know," he said. "Cancel it anyway." He ended the call and looked back at the girls curled together like petals of the same flower. He had made his choice, and this time he wasn't going to miss what mattered. The next morning Grace arrived at the hospital before sunrise. The hallways were dim and quiet-filled only, with the soft shuffle of nurses changing shifts and the distant hum of machines keeping patients stable. He walked with purpose but without rush, stopping first at the waiting area where the girls had slept the night before. They were still there, tangled together beneath a hospital-issued blanket, their cheeks flushed with sleep and their little arms draped over one another like they couldn't rest unless they were touching. Grace stood in the doorway and watched them, something deep inside his chest tightening with a kind of protective ache. He had never known. He had made decisions his entire life based on logic and returns, but this was different. This was something his heart understood before his mind could even form the words for it. He left a note with a nurse letting them know he would be back soon and then walked down to the ICU. Emma's condition hadn't changed overnight. She remained unconscious, her body still fragile, but holding on. Grace sat beside her again, this time with more certainty in his movements. He didn't just talk about the girls, he told her about himself, about the life he had built, the emptiness that came with success, and how all of it had started to feel meaningless the moment he saw three pairs of eyes staring up at him in that hallway. I used to think I had time, he said quietly, time to chase goals, time to come back to things I left behind, but the truth is I let go of you too easily, and now I realize I might have let go of the only part of my life that had real meaning. He stayed until the nurses reminded him it was time for rounds, then returned to the girls. They had woken by then, brushing sleep from their eyes and accepting juice boxes from a tired but kind volunteer. When they saw Grace walk in, their faces lit up, not with surprise but with the comfort of someone they now expected to see. It startled him how quickly he had become a constant in their eyes. He sat on the floor with them again, listening as they took turns explaining the names of their stuffed animals and which cartoons they hated. Jane, the quietest of the three, leaned into him without saying a word, simply resting her head against his arm while she colored. He didn't move. He didn't dare. That afternoon he met with the hospital social worker again, this time with questions not about visitation or policy but about guardianship. He didn't know the system, but he wanted to do this right. He wanted to make sure that no matter what happened to Emma, the girls wouldn't end up with strangers, wouldn't be lost in the shuffle of paperwork and state agencies. He gave his name, explained his connection, and then, because he didn't want to delay even a moment longer, requested a DNA test. The social worker, a sharp but compassionate woman named Marissa, listened closely. She didn't make promises, but she saw the look in his eyes and the way the girls clung to him. She agreed to move the process forward as fast as legally possible. That night Grace took the girls back to his condo. It was sleek, modern, cold in its perfect lines and polished glass. It had never been a place meant for children, but the moment they walked through the door holding his hands and carrying their little bags and favorite toys, the space felt different. Their giggles bounced off the walls, their tiny socks slipped across the smooth floors, and Grace found himself laughing more in that one evening than he had in months. He ordered pizza. He let them sit on the couch with greasy hands. He read bedtime stories in 3 different voices because they insisted each character needed their own. When they finally fell asleep in the guest room together in one bed, refusing to be separated, he stood in the doorway and watched them for a long time, overwhelmed by how natural it had all begun to feel. He thought of Emma again, thought of her lying in that hospital bed with no idea that the man she once loved had returned and was trying to put the pieces back together. He didn't know if she would ever wake up, but he knew without a shadow of doubt that if she did, she wouldn't find them alone. He would be there. And he wasn't leaving. By the end of the week, Grace had begun to fall into a rhythm, one that was unfamiliar and often chaotic, but surprisingly grounding. Mornings started with brushing tangles out of 3 very different heads of blonde hair, pouring uneven bowls of cereal, and learning the nuances of what kind of apple slices each girl preferred in her lunch. The structure of his old life, early calls, boardroom meetings, flights scheduled to the minute, had dissolved into crayons on the kitchen counter and a forgotten laptop gathering dust in the corner. He hadn't planned any of it, and yet he couldn't imagine walking away. He drove the girls to school in a car that once only carried briefcases and silence. Now it echoed with questions, arguments about cartoon characters, and one girl, usually Maddie, insisting on picking the music after drop-off. Grace found himself circling back to the hospital each morning, visiting Emma's room before any other part of his day. Her condition remained unchanged, but the nurses had gotten used to his presence, even leaving a second chair by her bedside. He spoke to her every day about the girls, about what they were doing, what they said, how Jane had started whispering a little more, how Chloe had told him he didn't know how to fold clothes the right way but that it was okay because you're trying. He told Emma that he missed her in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the emptiness that had grown inside him over the past 5 years. He admitted how scared he was to be raising children he hadn't known existed and how despite that he had never felt more certain about anything in his life. Her hand never moved, her eyes never opened, but he stayed anyway. One afternoon, after picking the girls up from school and helping them with their crafts at the dining table, he sat with Marissa, the social worker, to review the results of the DNA test. The proof was printed on a thin white page, stark and undeniable. He was their biological father. She handed it to him with a look that said she expected more of a reaction, but Grace only nodded. The test hadn't told him anything his heart hadn't already accepted. He had known it in the way Chloe rolled her eyes and how Maddie crossed her arms when she was frustrated, and how Jane stared without blinking when she didn't understand something. They were pieces of him, wild, gentle, stubborn, and brave. Marissa then began walking him through the process of becoming their legal guardian. At least temporarily, there would be evaluations, court dates, paperwork. It would take time, and until Emma recovered, no decision could be final. But Grace didn't flinch at the steps ahead. He simply asked what he needed to do and began doing it. He even started researching preschools closer to his apartment, places that had music programs and outdoor space and that didn't feel like holding cells. He asked the girls about what they liked and disliked about their current school, trying to make them feel included in decisions about their new lives. That weekend he took them shopping for new clothes, not because they didn't have enough, but because he wanted them to have something that wasn't secondhand or worn at the knees. They picked dresses with sparkles and light-up shoes and insisted he get a bright red tie so he could match. He wore it without argument. Later that evening they all cooked dinner together, which mostly meant he cleaned up flour explosions and tried not to burn the pasta. When the girls finally went to bed full of stories and sugar, Grace sat down on the edge of his couch looking at the empty space around him and realizing it no longer felt empty. It was filled now with tiny drawings taped to the fridge, mismatched socks under the table, and laughter still echoing down the hallway. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant asking if he would be available for a rescheduled board call in the morning. He stared at the screen for a long time before typing back a simple answer, "Not yet." He placed the phone down and walked to the guest room, peeking in to find all three girls curled up in the same bed, tangled in each other's limbs, deeply asleep. He watched them for a moment, overwhelmed by a feeling that had no name, only weight. He didn't know what the future would look like, didn't know how long Emma would remain in that hospital bed or what challenges lay ahead. But he knew with complete clarity that his life had been rewritten and he had no desire to go back to the one he had before. On the 12th day of Emma's hospitalization, something changed. It was subtle at first. Her fingers moved. Then her eyelids fluttered and the monitors picked up a slight shift in her vitals. Grace had just arrived, as he did every morning now, bringing coffee to the nurses and sitting by her bedside with quiet patience. He had grown used to the rhythm of the room, the sterile smell, the quiet hum of machines, but today when her hand twitched beneath his he nearly dropped the cup he was holding. The nurse rushed and checked the machines, whispered that it could be a sign of awakening. Grace barely breathed for the next 10 minutes. He leaned forward, spoke her name, watched her eyelids twitch again, and this time slowly open. Her gaze was unfocused, dazed, her lips dry and slightly parted. She blinked at the harsh light overhead and then slowly shifted her eyes toward him. At first there was no recognition, then as if memory caught up to consciousness, her brow furrowed, her voice came out cracked and barely audible, but it was enough. "Grace." He nodded, overwhelmed. "I'm here, I've been here." Her eyes welled up immediately, confusion swimming behind the tears. "The girls, are they? They're safe there with me," he said gently. "They've been brave, Emma. They waited for you every single day," she cried, then weakly, silently but completely. Grace held her hand, letting her process the reality she had woken into. The nurse gave them a few minutes before quietly stepping out, closing the door behind her. He stayed with Emma as she calmed, as the fog of sedation and fear slowly lifted from her face. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, voice still rough and barely above a whisper. "I wanted to so many times, but you were so far away. You were already living a different life. You should have told me," Grace said, but not accusingly. It was filled with regret, not blame. "I would have come, I would have been there. I was afraid," she admitted, "afraid you'd feel trapped. Or worse, that you'd feel nothing." Grace sat back, breathing in deeply, letting the weight of everything settle between them. "I didn't know, but the moment I saw them I did." Emma closed her eyes for a moment as if exhausted by the conversation. When she opened them again, she looked straight at him, vulnerable and honest. "Are you really here?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes, and I'm not leaving." He told her about the days she had missed, About the hallway, about how Maddie had stood tall like a little soldier, how Jane barely spoke but clung to her stuffed rabbit, how Chloe had asked hard questions and demanded answers. He told her about the pancakes he'd burned, the songs they sang in the car, the messy bedtime routines that somehow ended with all three of them in one bed. He saw her smile, tired but real, and for a moment he felt the world tilt back into place. When the doctor came in, they spoke in low tones. Emma's recovery would be slow, her body was weak and she would need rehabilitation, but the prognosis was good. She would recover. That night Grace brought the girls to the hospital, not into the room but just close enough. They stood outside the glass, and when Emma saw them, her hands trembled with emotion. The girls waved furiously, pressed their hands to the glass, and Emma pressed hers from the other side. She mouthed the words, "I love you." And all three girls did the same back. Maddie held up a drawing they had made that morning for stick figures holding hands beneath a house with a sun in the corner. It said home in big shaky letters. Emma cried again, and so did Grace. When they left the hospital that night, the girls were quiet in the car, holding his hands from the back seat. He looked at them in the mirror and said, "Your mommy's going to be okay?" Chloe asked. "And us?" He smiled softly. "You're going to be better than okay." Because now they weren't waiting anymore, they were beginning, and for the first time it felt like they were all part of the same story. The days that followed Emma's awakening were filled with slow progress, quiet miracles, and the kind of small victories that only mattered to those who had lived through uncertainty. Grace balanced hospital visits with school drop-offs, nighttime stories, and learning to braid 3 sets of blonde hair imperfectly but with effort that the girls never failed to praise. He had always thought multitasking meant juggling high-stakes deals and managing corporate crisis. Now he understood that true multitasking was holding a sick child in one arm while flipping pancakes for 2 others who refused to eat them unless they were shaped like stars. Emma's recovery moved steadily. She began speaking with more clarity, sitting up for short stretches, even requesting to read notes the girls had written for her. Grace brought them in for short visits, and every time they entered the room, Emma's energy seemed to return in waves. The girls never overwhelmed her. They were instinctively gentle, each offering affection in their own way. Maddie sat closest and asked about the machines. Chloe always brought stories to retell. Jane simply held her mother's hand, quietly watching her face with those large, thoughtful eyes. One afternoon, as Emma napped and the girls played with coloring books in the hospital lounge, Gray stood with Marissa by the window. The sun poured through the glass in golden beams, and the world outside moved like it had before, unaware of the tiny shifts that had turned his life inside out. Marissa had paperwork in her hands, documents that would allow Grace to take the next step toward permanent custody should Emma agree. The forms felt heavy in his hands, not with burden but with the realization that he was choosing this not because he had to, not because of obligation, but because somewhere in the chaos of the past few weeks he had become a father. Later that evening, Grace sat beside Emma in her hospital room. The lights were low and the girls had gone home with a trusted sitter. Emma's hair was pulled back now, and though her face still held traces of exhaustion, there was more color in her cheeks, more awareness in her gaze. She looked at him like someone seeing a familiar place through new eyes. "They love you," she said softly. "I love them," he replied just as quietly. "And you?" Emma didn't look away. "You've changed. You're softer but stronger somehow. I didn't know what I was missing," he said, "until I found it all standing outside a hospital room in pink dresses, crying. I wanted to protect them," she admitted, "from everything, including you. I understand why," Grace said, "but I'm here now and I want to do this with you, not around you." They talked for a long time, not about the past or blame, but about logistics, hope, and the uncertain path ahead. Grace told her about the girls' new favorite bedtime song, about how Jane had finally started talking more when she was coloring, about Chloe insisting they all eat the same cereal because that's what families do. He watched Emma take it all in, and he saw something soften further in her when she asked about the custody papers. He didn't push. He said he would wait, that her healing mattered more, that whatever decision they made it would be together. She reached out and took his hand. "I think we're already a family," she whispered. "We just have to learn how to be one." That night, as Grace tucked the girls into bed, he realized how right she was. It wasn't about claiming a title or defining roles. It was about presence, about consistency, about the 1,000 small choices made each day to love, to show up, and to try. The girls were asleep quickly, their bodies curled in familiar patterns, their trust in him no longer tentative but full. Grace stood at the doorway and looked at them, 3 lives that had once been hidden from him, now the very center of everything. And in that stillness he knew the hardest part was no longer the unknown, it was holding on to everything he'd found and never letting go. A month later, the hospital room where Emma had once lain pale and unresponsive stood empty. She had been discharged just 3 days earlier. walking out with slow but steady steps, her daughters clinging to each of her arms like the strongest support she could ever need. Grace had driven them home in his car, which had somehow become a second living room filled with crayons. In the glove box and cereal bar wrappers under the seats, they returned not to her old apartment, which had been vacated while she was hospitalized, but to Grace's home, now transformed. What was once sterile and minimalist had evolved into a space filled with warmth. There were toy baskets in the hallway, tiny socks stuck in the couch cushions, drawings taped to kitchen cabinets, and a table set for 5 every night. Whether or not everyone was hungry, Emma's first night home, they all sat around the dinner table eating spaghetti that Chloe had insisted be dyed pink. The girls talked over one another, giggling and giving chaotic updates on school. Emma listened teary-eyed at first until she too began to laugh. Her laughter was quieter than before, tinged with fatigue. But it was real. Grace watched her from across the table, not with pity or apology, but with admiration. She had survived something that would have broken many people, and yet here she was passing the salt, making sure Maddie wiped sauce off her cheek and reminding Jane not to eat with her fingers. It was a kind of strength that inspired a new kind of reverence in him. As the days passed, their routine deepened. Grace adjusted his work schedule, permanently transferring leadership of several projects and even stepping down from his role as CEO, keeping only the chairman's position so he could be home for bedtime stories and school pickups. The business world saw it as a shocking pivot. Headlines described him as walking away at the top. But Grace didn't care. He hadn't walked away. He had finally walked towards something. Every morning started with breakfast made together, often a chaotic parade of spilled milk and mismatched shoes. Every evening ended with the girls curled up in pajamas listening to one of Emma's stories or Grace's made-up space adventures featuring characters named after their favorite toys. On a Saturday in early spring, they threw a small party in the backyard to celebrate the girls' 6th birthday. Friends from school came, neighbors brought cupcakes, and someone had even arranged for a magician. But what stole the day wasn't the magic tricks or balloons. It was the moment. Emma stood, microphone in hand, voice trembling, and thanked everyone for being part of what she called the most unexpected, most beautiful second chance life could offer. Then she looked directly at Grace, her eyes soft and steady, and said, "And thank you for finding us when we didn't even know we were looking to be found." Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the girls were asleep surrounded by wrapping paper and glittery crowns, Emma and Grace sat outside on the porch beneath a string of lights. The night air was warm, the kind that settles in your skin like memory. They didn't speak for a while, just listened to the crickets and the faint sound of wind moving through trees. Finally Emma turned to him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed in touch, if I had told you back then?" He shook his head, not with regret but with clarity. "We might have had a version of this sooner, but maybe it wouldn't have been this version, and I like this one. It's messy and hard and completely out of my control, but it's ours." She nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You're not the man I left." He smiled and took her hand. "And you're not the woman who walked away." They stayed that way in silence for a long time, watching the house that now held the 4 people who had become his entire world. The laughter, the challenges, the noise, the quiet, it was all real, and it was theirs. Inside, taped to the fridge among the drawings and reminders, was a piece of paper written in colored marker by the girls earlier that week. It read in uneven, joyful letters, "Home is everyone being together always." And in that moment Grace knew they weren't just a family, they were a miracle rebuilt from pieces he never knew he had lost, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure it never fell apart again. From an author's perspective, the ending of this story feels not only emotionally satisfying but deeply earned. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or idealized romance to resolve the characters' struggles. Instead, it leans into something far more powerful: quiet redemption, chosen responsibility, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Grace doesn't become a hero overnight. He becomes a father by showing up day after day in the small, often messy moments that matter most. Emma's recovery, both physical and emotional, is believable because it's gradual, not rushed or romanticized, and the girls, each with their own personality and resilience, are never treated as props for Grace's transformation, but as full, vital characters who anchor the emotional core of the story. The final image of them all together, celebrating, laughing, living simply but meaningfully, doesn't feel like a fantasy. It feels like a life that was fought for and chosen, and that's what makes the ending beautiful. It's not about everything being perfect, it's about finally being real.